Welcome to the course Digital Transformation and Technological Innovation. So, we were into our introductory module that is fundamentals of information systems. So, let us pick up from where we ended in the last session. So, we were talking about the information systems architecture and the different components of IT that are needed to support information systems. Now, let us go through some of these information technology terms for more completeness, right. So, first one is we talked about hardware. The server part is an important element to support information systems or create digital infrastructure for the organization. So, hardware, what do we mean by hardware? Computer equipment. So, for us hardware for us is computer equipment used to perform input, processing, storage and output activities. So, all some would be input devices, some would be processing devices, some would be storage devices, some would be the output devices. So, all that put together, and maybe there would be a few peripheral hardware components also. So, that forms our hardware. So, hardware computer equipment used to perform input, processing, storage and output activities. Then when we say input devices, right, which will be used to perform the input activity, we can talk about keyboards, pointing devices such as mice, scanning devices, right, and the magnetic ink character readers. So, these are different ways to take inputs into the computer, right. Then next is processing devices. Now, somebody there has to be some sort of processing capability that will work on these inputs and then execute the steps, right. So, the processing devices are actually computer chips which are actually brain of the computer. So, computer chips containing a central processing unit referred as CPU and main memory. So, the processing devices are mainly the CPU, the computer chip, which will actually act on the inputs based on the instructions and do some processing some activity, right. And the main memory is also needed, because while the CPU is working on a particular input, it might have to store few things, right. So, that storage would be supported by the main memory that is actually used to used by the CPU while executing instructions, while executing steps, right. So, then next one is output devices. So, there we can list printers, screens. The screen we see the output, right. So, whatever after processing on the input, what is the output that can be displayed on the screen or that can be printed out. So, these becomes the output devices. So, through these we get to know what was the output of that particular activity. Then storage devices. So, there are solid state drives, flash drives, and then there are cloud drives nowadays. That is another options where we can actually store our files, output files or the input files, the data that we might have. So, it needs a storage for us to be able to maintain our database. We need storage. So, these drives, solid state drive, flash drives, cloud drives, these are the information technology components that complete that part, the storage part. Then the next is software. So, these are the computer programs which actually contain the logic that is operated on the inputs. So, software is the computer programs that govern the functionality of the computer. So, when through computer we are acting on a particular input, we are giving some input and some instruction is being executed, some activity is happening. There is somewhere some logic in different programs of the computer which are acting on the inputs given to it or already there, and then the functionality is executed. Then within the software there are multiple types that we can, the way we can categorize. One is system software. So, what is system software? So, this coordinates basic computer functions, right, such as startup, controls access to the system resources, and manages computer memory and files. So, certain software which we call system software, they will have to manage files, they have to manage the memory, computer memory, which is to be used by the CPU for executing instructions. Then they might have to manage other system resources, control other resources, because different activities might be vying for the same resources, and therefore, some sort of management is needed so that every activity gets the resource for it to be executed in due course of time, right. and the startup, how the system boots up, right. So that part is also categorized under system software. So examples, operating system is a typical example of a system software. So products, Windows, Android, Windows for mainly the laptops, the notebooks and desktop, Android mainly for smartphones, tablets and all that. And moving on, next category within software is application software. So application software, it performs a specific task for end users. End users are not interested in file management, memory management, startup and the controlling resource and all that. End users might be interested in calculating their expenses, the shopping that they did, adding all the items, checking through a computer, through the application software, let us say calculator in this case, that would be there in the computer as an application or utility. So end users would be interested in using that calculator, or maybe interested in using a web browser so that they can log in into their account in social media or university or company's account, right. So end users are always interested in performing a specific task that is meaningful for them, right. So the programs which facilitate that are referred to as application software, right, such as editing text documents, creating your CV, creating graphs, playing games, right. So all these are examples which are of interest to end users. The application software which the software which support these specific tasks of interest to end users, they are categorized as application software, while the system software mainly manages the resources, facilitate resources which are later used by the application software. Now all types of computers, whether we talk about the handheld computers, the smartphones, the tablet devices, or we talk about large supercomputers, they all need these elements, the input, processing, storage, output, system and application software. So these are main components, whether the hardware part or the software part, that have to be there in all types of computers, whether we talk about the handheld or the large supercomputers. Now the trend in terms of the computer hardware industry, which is actually in the business of manufacturing or rather producing these these products, these computer hardwares, right. The trend right now is to produce smaller, faster and more mobile hardware, right. So we are moving away from so we have already moved long way from mainframes to personal computers to laptops. Now the further movement is towards the smartphones, the handheld devices and the devices which are sort of plug and play, more portable, more mobile, right. So the trend in the computer hardware industry is to produce smaller, faster and more mobile hardware, so that the productivity gains are not just in a particular room in the organization, they could be anywhere within the organization, outside the organization, traveling, at home, right. So anywhere you would be able to use these computer hardware, able to interact with the information systems for your organizations, right. So this trend is actually supporting this kind of change in work life, right. So this trend essentially means that focus is more on producing smartphones, tablet computers, notebooks, right. So notebooks and laptops, there is small difference that laptops have slightly bigger screen sizes, slightly heavier, more durable components within it, while notebooks have slightly lightweight and smaller screen and slightly less life. Next part of the equation is the telecommunications. So what is telecommunication is about? Electronic transmission of signals for communications. So for a computer to be able to connect to another computer, or for a smartphone to be able to call another smartphone or connect to another smartphone or any other computing device, this transmission, electronic transmission is needed, electronic transmission of signals rather is needed, that is facilitated by the telecommunication technology. So this telecommunication technology is actually the enabler for computer networks. So one computer can connect to another computer because electronic transmission is possible, because it is being facilitated by the telecommunication technology. So what are the options in terms of telecommunication technology? So, as we already as end users we already know this, that there could be wired connections that we see in our labs, in our workplaces, where different computers they are connected to the internet and within the lab network or within the organization network via wired LAN, right. So, wired, then the wireless mobile phones, smartphones are example of the wireless connectivity, right. Then the satellite transmissions, right. So, when we are making long distance calls, so eventually there might not be sufficient wired or wireless connectivity from end to end, and therefore in between the satellite transmission might also be needed, right. So, the wired, wireless and satellite transmission, they complete the whole picture for one end user to connect to using using its own computer and connect to a computer which might be located in other part of the world, right. So, this telecommunication technology facilitates that networking through transmission of electronic transmission of signals. Moving on, networks so connect computers and devices from anywhere, right, and they facilitate electronic communications, right. So, underlying technology being the telecommunication. Then moving on to wireless transmission. So, the few points about wireless transmission. So, wireless transmission networks enable the usefulness and wide adoption of mobile devices. So, many countries in global south, especially countries like India and many other places, we did not actually go through the broadband revolution. We directly landed on the mobile revolution, where the wireless transmission networks played the major role. So, people all majority of the population might not be able to afford to laptops or desktops or those kind of devices, but they might be able to afford the economical low cost smartphones, and therefore the wireless transmission providing the connectivity that increase the usefulness and the adoption of mobile devices. So, the wireless transmission capabilities, wireless transmission networks and the mobile devices, the smartphone, they have really increased the internet users in global south, across the global south, all the countries that are there. So, when we say mobile devices, essentially we are talking about the smartphones and the portable computers. Now, while this penetration is happening and people are able to figure out that mobile devices are very useful because they are able to do so many activities while being in their village or town or cities, right. Less movement within village, within town, within city as well. They are able to do so many activities by just making connections, because so many things are actually driven by information or exchange of information. So, because of the wireless transmission network and the affordable mobile devices, this penetration has gone up, the usefulness, the meaningfulness of this kind of connectivity has gone up. So, the demand has increased. So, increased demand for faster high fidelity transfer of data and video. Now, as people are able to afford more better quality smartphones, they are also interacting with different kind of platforms, starting from YouTube, Netflix and many other platforms, where they are interacting with the entertainment content, other video content, audio, music, those kind of content. So, to be able to have a good experience when you are watching a video or listening to music, you need to have high quality content, so that you are able to enjoy that particular content. So, therefore, the demand for high fidelity transfer of data and video, because that video or audio file has to be transmitted back to the end user's computing device, that is smartphone. So, therefore, the transmission has to provide or facilitate faster high fidelity transfer of data. So, there is an increased demand for this, and as a consequence higher penetration, researchers, innovators, engineers, they worked on the wireless transmission technology, and currently we are at 5th generation wireless communication, and there is a plan for 6th generation in the development stage. So, already with 5G networks we are able to get very fast and good quality streaming of videos and music and all those content, right. So, moving on to the internet part. Now, while we talked about the computer networks and telecommunication technology facilitating that network by providing the electronic transmission of signal. Now, within all those computer networks that can be there, internet is the largest of them, largest computer network, right. So, most of our computers or computing devices are actually connected to the internet. So, essentially we are more often than not, most computing devices are part of internet, part of this largest computer network. Maybe the devices in the defense sector or the health sector, the critical mission critical sectors, space, defense, health, those might be isolated, those might not be all those devices in those organizations, defense organization, health and space organization might be part of the internet. But otherwise in many other industries, in personal professional space, most of the computing devices are part of this largest computer network, that is internet. So, all these devices connected, interconnected, and freely exchange of data is happening, free exchange of information is happening. Obviously, one has to pay for the data and connectivity, but in terms of one computer connecting to another computer, that exchange is happening freely. Now, what are the activities that are happening? We can see search. There are lots of search engines that we interact with, Google and Bing and many others. Buy, sell through e-commerce. We talked about some of these apps as an example of information systems in previous sessions. Booking tickets, investments, financial, other investments, right. Transfer payments for e-commerce or for any other store, local store, street vendors, everything is happening obviously through the internet, right. Listening to music, now people instead of storing their favorite music in their devices, now people directly listen to apps like Spotify, Apple Music and others, right. So, those are actually cloud apps. So, so that listening is again happening through internet. Listen to music, watch videos, read articles. So, all these activities that we see which were earlier happening in the traditional space through traditional means are now in the internet space and happening via computing devices and internet connectivity. Next concept is the database system, right. So, what is a database system? So, we talked about data information earlier. Now, we talked about storage also, right. So, all the data information that we have talked about, it is to be stored somewhere, right. So, storage is needed, and then it is the database system which actually uses those storage devices. So, what is database system? An organized collection of real life facts information. So, all the data information we talked about, that is actually stored in a database system. So, typically consisting of 2 or more related data files. So, if there are 2 or more related data files, right, then we can store within the database system. So, that becomes the definition of it. Now, an organization's database can contain facts and information on a number of points, customers, the customers that they are serving. So, all that data will be stored in the organization's database. Employees, the people who are working for them, running their business processes, functions. So, their data will also go into the database. Inventory, the products, other parts, components that the organization is using or selling, right, as part of their business. So, that would be there. So, that data will also go into the database. Sales that they are making to their customers. So, those transactions, sales transactions, they will also go into a database. Similarly, purchases, to be able to run their business processes, they might have to acquire certain raw materials, other artifacts. So, for that they might have to make purchases. So, that purchase transaction, that data and the other items that are purchased. So, lots of data would be generated, all that will also go into a database system, and there might be other things. So, overall we can say that an organized database will pretty much have all the things that organization is running as part of its processes and functions, right. So, the database system will provide interaction with these data points, with this information in the form of related data files. Now, when an organization needs a database to be able to run their information system, because all the data and the information is going to reside on a database system on storage, right. So, there would be a need for database storage more and more, because data will keep on growing, and therefore, you will need to connect more storage to your database systems, right. So, there is a growth, there is a need for database storage, and this growth for this need is driven by the growth in digital data and digital information. So, lots of digital information and digital data is being accumulated day in day out in many organizations, because most organizations are using information systems in one or other form, right. Maybe not for all its function, but part of it at least, right, at least the basic one. Maybe they will have at least the payroll system, or maybe they will have at least the transaction processing system, right. So, they would need the database system, and therefore, they will need the storage, right. So, there would be a demand for this database storage, and which is actually coming, which is actually driven by growth in digital data and digital information. So, where this digital data and digital information is coming, which organization might be interested in, and that is why they are storing all those data points, and therefore, they are needing more storage. Social media sites. So, every organization is maintaining their presence in social media, they are advertising their products, interacting with the customers, consumers, right. So, social media sites are like X and Facebook, they are generating lots of this business data that is of interest to organization through their own accounts in these social media platforms, right, or in general the data that is there, right. So, organization might be interested in obtaining this data, and therefore, the growth in digital data and digital information for most organization, and therefore, the need for storage. Similarly, online streaming, YouTube, Netflix, right. Similarly, IoT devices and sensors, right, the smartphones are example of it, and there are lots of sensors that are there in even a good enough smartphone device. So, all that data is getting accumulated, and through apps the permissions are granted, and many organizations are able to access that data from the consumers that they are getting through smartphones, right. Then the digital transactions. So, organization is making its own sales and other banking transactions. So, the banking, e-commerce, those kind of transactions most organization would be doing, right, because the digital transactions are increasing day in day out. So, therefore, this data will also be large data that will also be accumulated, and that will also need storage. So, when data is digital data and digital information is growing or driven, the growth is driven by so many factors, right, then the need for storage will go up. Then on top of this, the main thing, every organization might like to have their own small or large data centers depending on the size of the organization and the revenue and other things. So, data centers would be there, public and private. So, whether we talk about the public organization or the private organization, they will also have their own data centers. So, therefore, that will also contribute to the growth in digital data and digital information, and therefore, the demand for storage. Now, moving on. Now, when these challenges are there related to increasing data storage demand, then what are other consequences that will happen? Additional storage devices, that is one natural outcome, but then additional electricity to be able to power those devices. So, that will also be needed. Then additional space to house. So, within your data centers, if you are accumulating more data, so those devices, storage devices to keep that data, to store that data will also occupy space in your data centers, right. So, additional space to house these storage devices. Then security and safety of large databases, accumulating so much of data, and because of that size, complexity of managing that data might also come in, and therefore, there might be loopholes, and there might be attacks and misuse. Larger the data, a small theft can lead to larger leak of data also. So, therefore, the security and safety of large databases, that will also become a challenging aspect here. Now, what is the one solution that we can think of for all these issues? That also comes from information technology, that is cloud computing, right. So, cloud computing can address some of these issues that regular organizations face, or rather non-tech organizations face. Tech organizations might be better equipped to deal with these issues, having working on the technology, having understanding the risk and the weaknesses, and continuously working on the way out, right. So, the tech organizations are better placed to meet these challenges. Therefore, it is better for non-tech organizations, non-tech businesses to support their information system. They can go for the cloud computing options, right. So, cloud computing introduced a transformative shift in how data is stored, accessed and transferred, right. And now, when we have to share a file, we do not give it using a pen drive, or we do not have to email it and then worry about the size that is allowed in the email attachment. We use the cloud, right. We upload it in some cloud drive and then we share the link, right. The other person also does not have to store that file. They can directly look at that file using the cloud technology, right, using the cloud app, right. So, cloud computing is eliminating a need for storage at least one end of the network, right. One person is storing, other can access because it is shared via cloud. And then the tech firms, the vendors, the cloud vendors which are providing the cloud computing services over internet, they would be better equipped to address some of these challenges related to electricity, spacing, safety and security. So, many of these cloud vendors, they have moving their data centers to more cooler places where the electricity is cheaper and the sufficient talent is there that they can that they can hire to manage their cloud computing services and infrastructure. So, what is cloud computing? So, cloud computing is a computing environment where software and data storage are provided over the internet, and we refer that as cloud. So, when software and the data storage, if the whole computing environment, which essentially is for an end user, for a non-tech organization, the computing environment essentially means the software that they want to use and the data that they want to store, right. So, cloud computing environment provides that, right, over the internet. That is why this cloud terminology comes in. So, cloud services run on the provider's computer hardware. So, one big change that is happening, that the non-tech firm or the firm which is taking the cloud services is not now, when they take the cloud services, the data and the software is not within its premises. Now, it moves to the cloud vendors data centers. So, that is one shift. So, again the non-tech firms or the firms that are using cloud services, organizations that are using cloud services, they do not have to keep the space and hire IT staff to manage their IT and therefore support their information systems. So, that big change happens because of the cloud computing. Now, few other benefits that are there is the easy access to software and data via cloud services, right. So, now as I said, you can quickly share a file and the other person does not even have to download it. They can directly work with that file, view it using cloud apps, right. So, easy access there, easy way to share and all that. So, there are certain security concerns that might come into the picture. For example, file sharing or transfer of documents to clients or supplier by an employee. So, there might be accidental or because of the ease of sharing or intentional sharing of some of these documents that is possible. Employee might end up intentionally or unintentionally end up sharing documents or transferring files to the client or the suppliers, very easy, few seconds, right. So, that is one concern, the security concern that comes with this benefit of easy access. So, let us stop here, and the next time we will talk about the web, the World Wide Web in the next session. Thank you.